The foundation of that world rested upon a single absolute belief, unwavering faith in Eleusia, the sacred moon. The entire expanse of the Esorn continent bowed before this unquestionable truth, shaping the geography and the lives of its inhabitants. Under the aegis of this faith, a new continental order was erected to govern all, establishing rigid hierarchies. The great institutions consolidated their authority, ensuring their symbols were respected in every corner of the territory. Divine justice and military might became one entity, watching over the world under the eternal gaze of the moonlight. Prosperity flourished in the capitals, bringing an era of apparent beauty and tranquility to those who followed the rules. From atop their unreachable fortresses, the rulers observed their domain, believing that their utopia was perfect. However, peace demanded total control. Powers deemed unorthodox suffered brutal and merciless regulations. Any knowledge judged dangerous was chained and sealed, ensuring it would never threaten the stability imposed by the empire. Yet, far from the center of this absolute power, in the forgotten frontiers, the reality was quite different. In a silent corner of the forest where imperial law barely reached, an evil presence awaited in the darkness. The tranquility of nature was suddenly violated when a wild beast emerged from the dense vegetation. With brute force, the creature launched itself into the air, driven by instincts that ignored any civilized order. Primal fury overflowed from that being, revealing an uncontrollable threat about to collapse upon the world of men. Its roar shook the entire valley, announcing the imminent terror for the small village that rested defenseless below. The wild beast charged with blind fury, but the young man held his ground, awaiting the exact moment of impact. Richard smiled as he felt the rope stretch. His trap had worked perfectly, capturing the prey exactly as he had planned. However, before he could celebrate, an arrow came out of nowhere and pierced the animal, stealing his kill instantly. The shot had come from afar. Another group had interfered at the last second, taking advantage of someone else's work. Richard stared at the scene, incredulous and frustrated. The hunt he had prepared so carefully had been taken from him in the blink of an eye. Pirou appeared arrogantly, declaring loudly to everyone that the final blow and the glory belonged to him. The rival continued to mock as he walked, diminishing Richard's abilities and treating his strategy as mere child's play. Holding his hunting tool, Richard listened silently as his effort was ridiculed and distorted before everyone. Indignation grew in his chest. He could hardly believe the brazenness and audacity of that lie. When trying to protest the blatant theft, Richard received in return a cruel and personal insult about his mother. That final offense broke his self-control. The young man's gaze darkened, consumed by a cold and sudden fury. Completely ignoring the numerical disadvantage, he violently lunged at one of the lackeys who was laughing at him. The noble watched the scene, stunned, not understanding how someone he considered inferior dared to challenge his authority in that way. Richard immobilized his opponent on the ground, emanating a murderous intent so intense that it paralyzed the air around. The response came in the form of brute violence as he physically punished those who dared to cross the line. The impact was brutal. Richard not only retaliated, but threw his opponent with a force that defied any expectation, punishing the audacity of the attack. Faced with that demonstration of violence, the noble group's courage crumbled. Fear replaced arrogance as they tried to escape the hunter's fury. Richard kept his prey pressed against the ground, demanding total submission. At that moment, titles did not matter. Only the law of the strongest prevailed. Adrenaline pulsed through the protagonist's veins. He was not willing to let it go cheap. The hunt had awakened his most primal and relentless instincts. Pirou gnashed his teeth, consumed by humiliation. Having to back down before a commoner hurt his pride much more than any physical injury. The commotion in the forest eventually ceased. The echo of the battle dissipated among the trees, giving way to silence and the passage of time. Later, the night enveloped the village in tranquility. Far from the chaos of the hunt, a welcoming light promised refuge and recovery. Back in the safety of home, Richard had to deal with the consequences of his recklessness. He tried to explain himself, but the marks on his face betrayed the fight. The treatment burned, eliciting a muffled groan from the young man. However, a gentle, magical energy soon began to relieve the pain of the recent bruises. His mother gently scolded him while applying the cure, worried about his constant risks. Richard, however, insisted on asserting his independence and maturity. Recovered in moments, the young man displayed his usual vitality. His stubbornness was a force of nature that even injuries couldn't shake. She watched him with a mix of affection and melancholy. Time was passing too quickly, and that stubborn boy was becoming a dangerous man. With an enigmatic smile, his mother commented on the heritage they shared. Richard stopped, caught off guard by the sudden change of subject. The young man was stunned. He sensed a fluctuation of power in the air that defied the normalcy of that domestic environment. Without any effort, she manipulated the objects in the house with pure magic. A power that could shake empires was being used to serve tea. Richard proclaimed his desire with fervor, driven by a newfound ambition. He decided he would no longer accept being weak. The memory of being subjugated and humiliated, powerless before others, still burned in his mind like a bitter fuel. The young man swore to himself that, with that power, he would ensure that no one would ever step on him or treat him like trash again. His mother, however, intervened immediately. She needed to contain that excitement before her son's recklessness led him to ruin. She began to explain the reality of the world they lived in, expanding Richard's horizon far beyond the borders of that village. The power he sought was not trivial. It was a sacred heritage, the divine arts, revered and protected by the church as the pillar of civilization. But this power existed for a specific and terrible reason. It was the only defense against the primordial chaos that threatened to consume reality. Richard heard about the existence of an absolute evil, demonic forces lurking in the shadows, awaiting any opening to attack. Without the barrier erected by these arts, the entire world would be doomed to total destruction at the hands of these evil entities. However, there was a price. To master such arts without destroying himself in the process, she imposed a non-negotiable condition: the study of a forgotten language. The young man froze, confused. That intellectual and academic requirement was the last thing he expected to hear as a prerequisite for combat training. The woman noticed the hesitation in her son's eyes, but remained firm, knowing that he needed to accept that harsh truth to survive. She then revealed the final secret of that lineage. True strength lay not only in physical brutality, but in the wisdom needed to control it. Richard watched his mother's figure walk away, suddenly realizing that the woman who raised him possessed a depth he had never imagined. The weight of that lesson fell upon him. The path to greatness would be much more complex and arduous than his naivety had foreseen. The candlelight was lit to dispel the darkness of the old attic. The moment of truth had arrived, and ancient secrets were about to be revealed. Richard immediately pointed to the object that emanated a strange aura on the floor. The young man knew instinctively that the source of the power he sought resided there. His mother, however, remained calm in the face of the discovery. She recognized the importance of that isolated place, the only safe place for what was to come. The protagonist waited, impatient. Curiosity burned within him, eager to understand how a simple object could grant him the strength to never be humiliated again. She then revealed the sacred nature of the item. It was not a common spellbook, but a divine scripture linked to the very goddess who ruled that world. Richard reacted with immediate skepticism. He sought real and tangible combat power, and the idea of studying religious texts seemed like a waste of time for his goals. However, the woman explained that the tome contained secrets accessible only to the chosen ones. His own mother was surprised to realize that the artifact had reacted to her son's presence. The atmosphere suddenly changed. A mystical energy flooded the room, responding to the latent potential that was awakening at that moment. The young man did not hesitate and began the ritual. He decided to use the divine illumination, accepting the challenge to unravel what destiny held for him. An intense light enveloped Richard, transporting his consciousness. He was informed that he would enter a spiritual plane to receive guidance about his future. The mother watched her son leave, her gaze filled with seriousness. She knew that the test that was now beginning would irrevocably define his trajectory. While his physical body remained behind, Richard's spirit floated through the dimensions. His mother's voice echoed one last time, asking for absolute attention to the instructions. A luminous entity appeared before him on the ethereal plane. The test would not be a physical battle, but a choice between different paths of power that would be offered to him. The tension increased as the gravity of the choice became clear. Any decision made there would shape the very essence of who he would become. Upon regaining his sight, the protagonist found himself in a grandiose and impossible sanctuary. He had crossed the border of reality to enter the domain of the gods. Richard advanced through the runic circle, feeling the ancient energy vibrate beneath his feet. The test to awaken his potential had begun. However, a sudden change in atmospheric pressure made him stop. The young man realized that he was not alone in that space. The scenery expanded, revealing pillars of light that connected the ground to the mystical firmament, delimiting the arena of trial. Before he could process the grandeur, an invisible force pushed him, demanding an immediate reaction in the face of the unknown. Colossal statues emerged from the ground as an imperious voice ordered him to make his choice between the paths presented. The protagonist felt the weight of responsibility crushing him. The magnitude of those divine presences was far greater than he had imagined. The first entity revealed itself, offering a path linked to temperance and spiritual balance. Right next to it, another stone figure promised the devastating power of retribution to punish enemies. There was also the offer of the Silver Moon armament, an art focused on pure and offensive combat. Judgment and foresight also presented themselves, surrounding the boy with more alternatives than he could process. Richard recoiled, stunned. The excessive amount of paths contradicted the instructions he had received about the test. Suddenly, the mystical vision shattered, replaced by the physical and visceral sensation of holding someone injured. The divine scenery disappeared, giving way to darkness and the metallic smell of fresh blood from a tragedy. He found himself thrown to the ground, surrounded by the brutality of a massacre that seemed too real to be an illusion. The memory of pain and the fury of a bloody defeat invaded his mind, testing the limits of his sanity. The maternal figure watched him with a look full of affection and serenity. The mystical energy that enveloped her seemed ready to heal any wound. The sacred tome reacted to that presence, violently opening its pages as it released all the knowledge contained within. With a gentle smile, the woman extended her hand towards the young man. She called him, offering an irresistible invitation to accept his destiny. Richard froze, stunned by the familiar sight before him. He hesitated for a brief moment, trying to process the reality of that encounter. However, his previous determination spoke louder. The boy cried out to the heavens, demanding not brute power but true wisdom. He screamed with all the strength in his lungs, desperately seeking the understanding needed to mature and become a complete man. In response to his sincere wish, one of the stone divinities lit up, standing out among the others as the bearer of the answer. The ritual circle entered total resonance. Pillars of energy connected the spiritual plane to the hunter's unwavering will. However, the answer did not come from the light. A colossal and dark presence began to materialize, looming behind the protagonist. The young man felt a chill run down his spine. Terror took over his gaze as he realized that he had invoked something much darker. The revealed entity was not a benevolent goddess, but rather the representation of the hidden and tragic face of the moon, marked by eternal suffering. Richard hesitated, confused and frightened. He suddenly understood that the source of that power resided in darkness, not in clarity. The divine image emanated a deep and palpable sadness, suggesting that the wisdom he sought was intrinsically linked to pain. The boy felt himself sinking into a metaphorical abyss. As he reached out, he finally understood that there would be a terrible price to pay for that knowledge. The vision ceased abruptly, bringing him back to reality. Richard found himself kneeling before the grimoire, exhausted, under the silent watch of the one who guided him. The ritual ended, leaving a heavy silence in the air. Richard remained motionless in the center of the magic circle, absorbing the consequences of his choice. His mother watched the scene, feeling that something fundamental had changed in her son. Immediate concern took over her as she noticed his state. The young man's body reacted violently to the absorbed energy. Physical pain struck him, forcing a harsh cough as smoke escaped his lungs. However, the suffering was interrupted by a sudden instinct. The hunter sensed an imminent threat even before seeing it, freezing on alert. But he wasn't fast enough. His mother acted first, pushing him with brute force to get him out of the path of an invisible attack. An observing presence manifested, a cold and penetrating gaze that seemed to transcend the physical reality of that critical moment. Richard felt himself falling into a surreal void, as if gravity itself had been distorted by the magic around him, separating him from the ground. As he plummeted through the lines of ethereal power, he heard his name being called urgently, an anchor trying to pull his consciousness back. In the real world, the devastating attack hit the spot where he had been seconds before. A dark force collided violently against his protector. The impact was brutal. The woman was thrown backwards, unable to resist the fury of that sudden blow that should have killed her son. She landed hard on the cold ground, stunned and vulnerable, as she tried to comprehend the magnitude of the threat that had invaded the sanctuary. Before her, a monstrous silhouette rose from the smoke and rubble, an incarnation of darkness ready to continue the massacre. In that instant of terror, Richard's mind was transported to a distant memory. A familiar voice about wisdom echoed in his thoughts. He remembered a figure from the past, someone who had taught him about the nature of the world with a strangely nonchalant attitude. The words of that memory resonated with a new and terrible meaning. The young man realized that this cruel destiny had been predestined long ago. Richard's mother realized that passive defense would not be enough against the impending onslaught. With fierce determination, she braced herself to counterattack before it was too late. The woman invoked an ancient divine art of foresight, anticipating the chaotic blows that would follow. She then channeled her remaining magic, imperatively ordering the protection spell to activate. The enemy's true nature was revealed. It was undeniably a dreaded shadow creature. The energy clash was brutal, throwing Richard away as his mother screamed his name in despair. She fought against her own exhaustion, keeping the barrier up to prevent the darkness from consuming her son. The physical confrontation ceased momentarily, leaving both isolated in the silence of the destroyed house. The woman turned her attention to the young man, anxiously seeking any sign that he was still safe. Richard, however, remained with his head down, enveloped by a heavy and immobile aura. Unfortunately, the origin of those beasts was ancient, and their hunger for chaotic energy insatiable. These creatures saw magic as a feast, twisting minds to transform users into agents of chaos. What no one expected was that the corruption had reached so far, tainting even the lunar divinity. The young hunter fell into a deep trance, now completely vulnerable to the machinations of that invading force. Upon being touched by the darkness, Richard became a living beacon, attracting danger to that place once more. The instability in Richard's soul acted as a beacon in the spiritual world. Primitive monstrosities began to gather, drawn by the promise of a vulnerable prey. The young hunter faced a brutal ultimatum. Either his body would be destroyed by the conflict of energies, or his consciousness would be eternally devoured by the shadow creature. Meanwhile, in the physical world, the night seemed peaceful, oblivious to the desperate battle taking place inside the boy's mind. However, the peace of the house was suddenly broken. A terrible premonition forced an immediate reaction. Richard's mother raced against time. She knew that every second lost in the trance brought her son closer to an irreversible fate. She ransacked the room frantically. The peaceful life she had built was no longer enough. She needed to recover what she had buried in the past. Finally, she found what she was looking for. They were ancient tools, the key to awakening a power she had sworn never to use again. For a decade, she maintained her anonymity, but the legendary figure who once defied empires could no longer hide in the face of imminent danger. She accepted the risk and channeled her mana. The disguise of a common woman dissolved, giving way to the formidable mage that existed underneath. The ancient pact was invoked. By signing with her true name, Elena reactivated the magical heritage of the Archeron family. A pillar of pure energy erupted from the residence. The force of the spell was so great that it tore through the tranquility of the night, visible for miles. Elena watched the result of her invocation. She knew she had just exposed her location to her enemies, but Richard's safety was the priority. There was no room for regrets in her gaze. She was ready to face the consequences of revealing her true nature. In the ethereal plane, help arrived. Elena's projection manifested behind the young man, recognizing that corruption was about to win. With desperate urgency, she reached out to intervene, determined to pull Richard back from the abyss before it was too late. In the depths of a distant memory, a desperate farewell unfolded. He protected her from the impending darkness, entrusting her with what they held most precious. Elena recalled that man's last wish. Their son carried the blood of the Archeron family and a demonic legacy that she vowed to protect until the boy was ready to know the truth. For 10 years, she lived in the shadows to keep that secret safe. However, faced with mortal danger, Elena broke her vow of silence and invoked the power she had buried. The disguise of a common peasant woman instantly dissolved. Magic flowed through her, revealing the formidable sorceress that existed beneath the maternal facade. She did not hesitate to use her true strength. Elena knew that exposing her identity was a small price to pay for Richard's survival. A pillar of pure energy connected the earth to the heavens. The signal was unmistakable, a beacon announcing her return to the world, regardless of who was watching. As soon as the ritual ended, the mother supported her fainting son. Her embrace was the only safe haven against the overwhelming forces that had been unleashed. When Richard finally regained consciousness, the chaos had disappeared. The young man woke up dazed in the safety of his home, his mind fragmented by the trauma. He sought answers in her face, but found only her usual gentle smile. Elena tried to convey tranquility, although both knew that everything had changed. However, the silence that hung in the room was heavy. The veil of normality had been torn and could not be mended. The young man felt a chill as he tried to organize his thoughts. The near-death experience brought visions that his human mind could barely comprehend. He remembered the spiritual abyss where he had been suspended. In that deadly stillness, the lunar entity had left only an enigmatic phrase etched into his soul. Elena watched her son's distress with seriousness. She realized that his contact with the ethereal plane had left deep marks. Richard struggled to describe the feeling of enlightenment he experienced. Although his consciousness was clouded at the time, the certainty of that revelation remained. The young hunter delved into his thoughts, trying to decipher the hidden meaning. He knew that those words would define his destiny from that moment on. Upon awakening, Richard immediately realized that something fundamental had changed in his perception. The young man felt an unprecedented strength coursing through his muscles. His senses were so sharp that he could pick up distant details in the night landscape outside. A vision of the past emerged in his mind, bringing the silhouette of a paternal figure shrouded in shadows and mystery. Elena decided it was time for the truth. She revealed the identity of his father, a man named Ron who carried demonic blood in his veins. The revelation hit Richard hard. The hunter absorbed the information, trying to connect that dark origin with his own existence. The elf hesitated, feeling the overwhelming weight of guilt. She knew that the secret kept for years had created a chasm between them. Childhood memories surfaced. Richard recalled the times when, innocently, he had asked about his absent father on his birthdays. Elena, however, offered a real choice. She asked directly if her son wished finally to meet the one who gave him life. The young man recoiled, stunned by the shock. His mother hurried to beg forgiveness, deeply regretting having hidden the truth for so long. She explained that the silence had been necessary, but admitted that the moment of reunion was inevitable. Destiny was already set. Elena warned that he would see his father very soon, as an emissary had already been sent. Richard lowered his gaze, processing the news. The reality of his simple life was crumbling to give way to a dangerous legacy. The tension hung in the air as his mother called out to him, fearing that the revelation would drive him away forever. But fear gave way to determination. The young man faced Elena and stated with conviction that he also wished to meet his father. Relief washed over the room. Mother and son hugged tightly, sealing the reconciliation and accepting together the uncertain future that awaited them. In the depths of a distant memory, a warrior enveloped his beloved in a protective embrace. The silence of that moment carried the weight of a farewell that would mark their destiny forever. Her tears flowed uncontrollably, echoing the pain of an ancient tragedy. That goodbye seemed to repeat a cruel cycle that they desperately tried to avoid. Years later, far from that darkness, the sun bathed the golden fields, where life followed its peaceful and monotonous course. The peasants worked on the harvest, oblivious to the outside world. However, the tranquility of that afternoon was about to be brutally interrupted by unwanted visitors. The young farmer wiped the sweat from his forehead, distracted by his companion's question about the strange movement at the entrance to the village. Suddenly, the color drained from his face. The young man realized too late that the approaching presence did not bring good news, but rather mortal danger. The imperial cavalry emerged from the forest, imposing their authority with the deafening sound of hooves and armor. Fear instantly paralyzed all who witnessed the arrival of the squadron. One of the knights blocked the path and demanded immediate answers. The worker, trembling before that imposing figure, barely managed to stammer a confirmation. Without showing any mercy, the soldier prepared his weapon. That interrogation was not a friendly request, but a sentence that could be executed right there.